Assassin's Creed is a series that's lost its way. What started as a wholly unique premise soon became a drab, yearly retread of the same tired formula. It's a real shame. Assassin's Creed remains very special to me. I remember waiting for weeks and weeks to get my hands on a copy of the very first Assassin's Creed game back in 2007. I sat and I watched the same trailer over and over again. I couldn't wait to roam around the Holy Land as a master assassin, travelling from city to city and repelling the Templar Order. My excitement quickly overwhelmed me, and I'm ashamed to admit that I did eventually dig through my poorly hidden Christmas presents to find a copy of the game, and I ended up playing it under the cover of darkness in the hours leading up to Christmas Day. Sorry, Mum. Over the past few years, the Assassin's Creed series has seemingly ran out of steam. Ubisoft have made some critical mistakes with their handling of the last few titles, resulting in the series being put on hiatus in 2016 while Ubisoft, as they put it, took a step back and re-examined the franchise. Having recently picked up a copy of 2015's Assassin's Creed Syndicate, and with the arrival of a remastered Ezio collection being released for the 8th generation of consoles in November of last year, I felt it would be an ideal time to do a bit of re-examining of my own. Looking back on it now, I realise that the original Assassin's Creed was a case of style over substance. For its time, it truly was incredible looking. The ancient cities of Damascus, Acre and Jerusalem were rendered with superb detail, and all three of these gameplay areas were packed with crowds and had suspiciously easy to climb buildings. These pretty visuals, however, could not detract from its repetitive mission structure that never really evolves throughout the duration of its 15-hour storyline. History has a funny way of repeating itself, as Ubisoft's later title Watch Dogs suffered from a similar case of having a fantastic idea but not quite pulling it off. Many people, including myself, liken this scenario to Assassin's Creed and its much superior sequel released in 2009. Before we can really appreciate just how good Assassin's Creed 2 really was, however, we need to get back to where it all started. The setting of Assassin's Creed was somewhat of a surprise to many. It wasn't until its release that gamers discovered that it in fact took place in the future. You play as Desmond Miles, a bartender with a hidden past, who is kidnapped by the corporation Abstergo and forced to enter a machine called the Animus. The Animus works by finding memories hidden in DNA and showing the user, through a projection, information that is stored within these memories. Warren Vidic, the presumed head of the project, informs Desmond that they are looking for something hidden away in his memories that his employers desire, and that in order to find it, Desmond will have to relive the genetic memories of his ancestor Altair ibn Ahad, a member of the Assassin Order in the Crusades. Whilst the majority of this game takes place within the Animus, it is possible to walk around the lab in between sequences, and these interim periods allow for Desmond to talk to Lucy, a technician working on the Animus, as well as eavesdrop on conversations between herself and Vidic in order to gain a better understanding of just what Abstergo are planning and ultimately what will become of him when their objectives are met. After grudgingly agreeing to the demands of his kidnappers under fear of death, Desmond enters the Animus. He then takes over as Altair, sent on a special mission to Solomon's Temple to recover an important artifact, arriving just in time to find Robert de Sable, the Grand Master of the Order of the Knights Templar, sworn enemies of the Assassins, attempting to retrieve it first. Altair's arrogance gets the better of him, however, and in trying to kill de Sable he misses his mark, leaving him alive, and is forced to leave the collapsing temple. Now, plenty of people have voiced a negative opinion on Altair, and I must admit that hearing his strong American accent in and amongst the Middle Eastern dialect is a little ridiculous. However, I do think that Altair's characterisation as somewhat of a blank slate was an intentional move from Ubisoft in order to allow the player to connect with the character, much in the way Desmond is whilst he's in the Animus. And there are similar examples of this in games such as Grand Theft Auto 5, where the character of Franklin is very subdued and seemingly underdeveloped in comparison to the over-the-top approach of both Michael and Trevor. I'd like to think this was an intentional move on Rockstar's part in order to give the player, us, a point of reference within the game world. Later protagonist designs ditch this approach, however, Ezio Auditore being a notable example of being extremely well developed as a character. Upon his return to the assassin stronghold in Masyaf, Altair discovers that it is currently under attack from Robert de Sable and his men. This segment of the game introduces the combat element, something that has undergone plenty of redesign in future titles. The main problem I've found with the Assassin's Creed game is that the combat is simply too easy, and the original game is no exception. Once the counter ability is learnt, the combat descends into tapping the counter button for an instant kill, and whilst it certainly looks cinematic and cool, it just doesn't feel satisfying enough. Later games attempted to add more depth to the combat, in particular Assassin's Creed Unity and Assassin's Creed Syndicate. However, if anything, these changes made the combat even easier in most gamers' eyes. After initially repelling the Templars, Altair is severely reprimanded for his actions in Solomon's Temple and stripped of his title and rank. He's then ordered to track and assassinate 9 key people throughout the Holy Land in order to bring peace between the Crusaders, led by Richard the Lionheart, and Salah ad-Din's Saracen forces. This then brings us to the main crux of the game, gathering intel either from pickpocketing, eavesdropping, or intimidating people close to your target. Unfortunately, the game doesn't deviate from the formula throughout these 9 assassination targets, and it is very easy to get bored with the constant repetition. This is at odds with the fact that each actual assassination is played out differently, forcing you to adapt your style to suit the situation, using a combination of stealth, eagle vision, a glorified enemy tagging system, and timing in order to approach your target undetected and kill them. It's a real shame that Ubisoft did not think to implement this kind of fluidity to the investigations, and thankfully future games in this series did adopt this design. Travelling from Damascus, Acre, and then finally Jerusalem, and as the body count notches up, Altair notices that each of them in their dying moments make a confession that what they did for the people to prepare for a new world order. These confessions lead Altair to question whether he's doing the right thing throughout the course of the game, and he eventually comes to the conclusion that he is. The so-called NWO requires the sacrifice of free will, something abhorrent in the eyes of the Assassin Brotherhood. With men on both sides killed, Altair discovers that de Sabler's last ploy is to attempt to unite the Christian and Muslim armies together against the Assassins. He chases down Robert and catches up to him in front of Richard the Lionheart, who says a trial by combat should take place, with God deciding who is right, and so triggers one of my least favourite boss fights in the entirety of the Assassin's Creed series. De Sabler is an absolute pain in the arse to kill, and the usual countering insta-kill move will not work here, forcing you to enter a guessing game as to when to attack. Once Altair finally wins, he tells Rich that God had nothing to do with it, he did it all himself. Well, actually I did. And then tries to convince the king that ending the war would be beneficial to both parties, to which the king disagrees. Nice try. Before he's kicked the bucket, de Sabler tells Altair that Al-Mualim, the Grand Master of the Assassins, is actually a Templar too. During the modern day sections, Desmond learns that Abstergo is actually a front company for a modern day version of the Templars, and that their desires are much more sinister than just finding an artifact. They want complete control over the entire world using a so-called Piece of Eden. We'll learn more about them in later games. Altair promptly heads back to Masyaf to confront his mentor, who has managed to activate the artifact from Solomon's Temple, named the Apple. Al-Mualim tells Altair that the apple can conjure illusions, and that all religious miracles are products of the artifact. He then performs a cool party trick creating clones of himself, triggering the final boss fight, which isn't nearly as difficult as the previous one, and Altair wins fairly quickly. Upon his victory, he recovers the apple from his master's body, and it activates, showing a globe with locations marked all over it. To what purpose, we don't know, yet. With the memory complete, Desmond is pulled out of the Animus, and is told that a small band of assassins are trying to mount a rescue effort in order to save him. Lucy, the girl we'd mentioned earlier that he'd been talking to every time he came out of the Animus, informs him that she's actually an assassin working undercover at Abstergo, and that she's going to help him. When she leaves the room, Desmond discovers that he can use an ability called Eagle Vision, the enemy tagging system I mentioned earlier, a bleeding effect caused from using the Animus for so long. He begins to see symbols all over the floor and the walls that can't be seen by anybody else. As it turns out, the previous test subject, Subject 16, was cooped up in the Animus for so long that he ended up going completely batshit, and painted the walls with his blood to leave a bunch of cryptic clues behind. clues that hint of a pending apocalypse on the 21st of December 2012, the same date that a proposed satellite created by Abstergo is due to be launched into the atmosphere, one that will permanently end the war between themselves and the assassins. Upon seeing these symbols, the credits roll. Now, if that sounds like a lot to digest, it may concern you to know that as far as the later games in the series go, Assassin's Creed actually has a fairly simple plot. We've got plenty more confusing and interwoven narratives to go yet. Assassin's Creed is a game that is forgotten by many. It had plenty of problems, of course, and these problems have only been further increased by the passage of time. Despite these issues though, Assassin's Creed remains an important game. It kickstarted a franchise that remained strong for many years, and is still regarded as one of Ubisoft's biggest successes. Make sure you're subscribed to COGconnected so you don't miss the coverage of the rest of the Assassin's Creed series, continuing with the phenomenal Assassin's Creed 2.